I want to start by saying two things. First of all, to congratulate you on the coming merger. I think that's great. As you know, you and I have talked about that for a number of years. I think that that's mobilizing resources in the right way. That's number one. And number two, to build on what the congressman said, and that is that when I started medical school, one of the first patients I saw as a junior medical student had lupus in the brain, CNS lupus. And the prognosis was very bad. She died. She died shortly thereafter. It was the first patient I was ever assigned as a medical student. And that had an impact on me. And when I think about where we are today, although we don't have a lot of medicines that are specific for lupus, we're looking to develop those medicines specific for lupus, but we have made great strides in terms of the improving the health and well-being of patients with lupus. Before I talk actually about the action plan and how it was developed, I do want to tell you a little bit about the NIH. For those of you who don't know, the mission is very straightforward. We are the major funder of biomedical research in the world, actually. It is through your tax dollars that we are funded, and it's through the Congress that we get those tax dollars, the executive and the legislative branch. The mission is to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, reduce illness, and disability. So research is our mainstay. Peggy touched upon training. If we don't train the next generation of scientists, 20 years from now, we won't be anywhere. So people who came before us invested in us, and we need to invest in the next generation of scientists. So that's why we actually, as an institute of the NIH, support a lot of training programs and have a high priority for training, particularly in areas like autoimmune diseases. And then, of course, without dissemination of the knowledge, it's worthless. So we have a real commitment to disseminate knowledge not only to the scientific community, but also, of course, to the lay community and to the public with things like what you need to know about lupus, who has lupus, things like that. And we hope that people use our information services. So this just gives you a picture of how we spend the appropriated dollars. The NIH in general, this is fiscal year 2015. We're now in fiscal year 2016. The budget is about $32 billion. Most of that money goes to support extramural research. What do we mean by that? We mean that those are the academic and medical centers and research institutions around the country and to a lesser extent around the world to support basic and clinical and translational research. The rest of the research goes for support, management support, about 5%, but also for an intramural program that you'll hear a little bit more about. And our divvying up of the 500 plus million in 2016, it's 540 million. Most of that goes to the extramural community. Now, fortunately for lupus and the field of lupus, it is not only the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, belovedly known as either NIAMS or NIAMS, but there are many other institutes that have an interest in lupus. And they have an interest in lupus, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing because investigators like Dr. Gallucci and others have the possibility of not only being supported by us at the NIMS, but also the possibility of being supported by other institutes that have one or another of the interests in lupus. The National Institute of Digestive Disease and Kidney, for example, have a real interest in lupus nephritis. We look at the whole picture. The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease looks at the basic research in immunology that may be the basis for the disease. But all of us are working together, and in fact, most of those that are highlighted here, most of the institutes that are highlighted here, played a very active role in addition to the voluntary and professional organizations like the Lupus Foundation of America, like the Alliance for Lupus Research, like the SLE Foundation, which is sponsoring this meeting today. They played an important role in defining this lupus research plan. It's not just one person who puts it together, it's many who put it together. What's the purpose of the plan? The purpose of the plan, first, was to respond to a request from Congress to update that 2007 lupus research plan. And as I said at the outset, to improve the health and well-being of individuals with lupus through research and research training being the investment in the future, and to provide a resource for investigators as they develop independent approaches to address scientific opportunities in lupus. And you'll hear about some of the resources when Bob Carter talks about it. This is a slide that I made almost 20 years ago when the director of NIH asked me to put together a booklet on how the NIH sets priorities. And this slide hasn't changed very much, except for the logo that's in the middle. Used to have a picture of Building 1, now it has the logo. But basically, this is how we work. We get inputs from lots and lots of people, not only from the Congress, not only from the executive branch, but from voluntary groups, to talk about what are the priorities, what are the needs from the doctors out there. We have to have doctors out there who are specialized in areas that take care of patients so that there's better early diagnosis, there's better definition of disease. So we get lots of input from lots of people in terms of putting out not only setting our priorities, but also in putting together a lupus research plan along with our other institutes. What are the areas of opportunity that are highlighted in the plan? And there is an executive summary that you can look at, and the executive summary actually touches on each of these areas, the cause and prevention, mechanisms of disease, Bob will be talking about this, new treatments and interventions, diagnosis and clinical care, behavioral and biopsychosocial and health services research, special populations that are affected by lupus, disproportionately African Americans and Hispanics. Disproportionately African Americans and Hispanics have worse disease right at the outset and have a worse prognosis, and training and collaborations. Critically important. Collaborations are the key word nowadays, and has been a key word actually for a long time, and that's how advances have been made. So what are the key questions? Is lupus one disease or many? Why do some people get lupus of the kidney and not get lupus of the brain? Why do some people get lupus of the brain and not the kidney? And why do some people get lupus of the skin and not elsewhere? Those are the types of questions that are being answered by some of the initiatives that you'll hear about. How can new and emerging research tools and technologies advance our understanding of disease mechanisms? How can these resources be built so that not only people who are already in lupus research can utilize them, but that we can attract people from other fields to do lupus research? In fact, I would say that we fortunately have a tremendous cadre. I'm not saying this just because of you, but we have a tremendous cadre of really smart people working on lupus. I mean, really smart people. Some of our best scientists are working on lupus research and on autoimmunity. And how can we facilitate the development of new and emerging treatment paradigms, perhaps through the Accelerating Medicines Partnership? And how can various sectors work together to more effectively conduct and support lupus research and research training? Again, that's working together. What are the next steps? The next steps continue to work with other institutes and centers and stakeholders, build our focus on lupus in the NIAMS intramural program. We have recently recruited an outstanding investigator from the University of Michigan, actually 2 years ago. Bob will tell you a little bit about her work, and we will continue to develop the Accelerating Medicines Partnership and other collaborative efforts. And with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Bob to talk about what some of the advances have been and what some of the future holds.
Thank you, Steve. It's my pleasure to get a little more granular on lupus itself. and where we are with the NIH and how we're trying to advance it on the basis of the plan. What I wanted to do is work off the key questions that Dr. Katz introduced. The first one being, is lupus one disease or many? And I think all of us know how heterogeneous the disease and how it affects different people, as Steve alluded to. So one of the studies we've supported is by Judith James at Oklahoma, who took patients and then took a whole bunch of blood samples sort of at the outset of her study, and then followed them for up to 12 weeks, and then looked to see who got worse, who flared, and then studied what blood tests looked like in those who did flare or those who didn't, and came up with an algorithm that actually could predict the people who would flare. Now, that needs a lot more work to validate and refine, but that's the first step to understanding who needs more aggressive treatment and who perhaps we can take a foot off the accelerator a little bit. And that, similarly, Jane Salmon, working at Hospital Special Surgery, had a study in women with lupus who were pregnant. And there's been an awful lot of concern over the years that the pregnancy was bad for the lupus and the outcomes of the pregnancy were a problem. Working with Jill Byan at NYU, what they found was that most patients actually, if their lupus was quiet, in a quiescent phase when they got pregnant, actually did pretty well, did quite well. So that was really good news. However, as of course, some patients had problems, and what they also found was certain blood tests that could predict, or certain characteristics of the patient, that could predict those who actually would be at greater risk for an adverse outcome. So those are the types of studies to try to understand the differences between patients with lupus and be able to start to get the biomarkers actually Peggy alluded to that help us understand which way the disease is likely to go. I'd like to turn now to the next step, which is understanding the disease and developing new treatments. So some of the work done that Dr. Katz alluded to, Mariana Kaplan from Michigan, who moved to NIH, and she'd been studying a type of blood cell called a neutrophil, which is really good and critical for fighting bacterial infections. In fact, when they get triggered, they release these things called nets, which you can imagine are quite good at trapping bugs as they go through your system. Unfortunately, this is what happens in lupus patients even without an infection, and you can imagine those nets in your blood system is not such a good thing. But it's understanding these basic pathways that cause disease. Another one that supported ex-out through our support of extramural funding, which is, Steve said, is 85% of our budget, was Terry Means at Massachusetts General Hospital, who studied a pathway that's been around for decades. So we as mammals are very proud of our immune system. We can get a vaccine and learn how to not get polio or whatever. Lower animals don't have that, but they still can recognize foreign things through certain genes that they inherit. And one of them that's in fruit flies is called the toll receptor, and it turns out that we have that as well. It turns out that it's a way that you can recognize when bad things are happening in your blood, like if you got a bacteria in your blood or if you got a skin wound. Well, it turns out that this pathway gets active in lupus even without those types of infection. It's what we call a danger signal. It gets activated in lupus, perhaps because things like the neutrophils are getting activated and releasing these internal danger signals. Well, Dr. Means has studied how this pathway is abnormal in lupus. And the reason that both of these are important is that there are pathways that they are working out. They're working out the proteins and the steps that lead to these abnormalities. And there's steps in those pathways where we have known drugs that can interrupt those pathways. So the thinking is that by understanding those pathways, the basic mechanisms that establish disease and the pathways that control them, using drugs that we actually already have available, we can do a better job of treating lupus. A couple other things to mention that we're doing at NIH. One is that we do have a natural history study on lupus, sort of like the biomarkers, things I referred to earlier, to understand how the disease progresses, and would encourage anybody to enroll. We also have a couple drug trials going. These were based on older work done at NIH to understand basic mechanisms of immunity and how it goes wrong in lupus. And based on that, we now have 2 trials at NIH in lupus patients using existing drugs to see if they can make patients better. This is called repurposing, and I actually would salute the role that the LRI has made in also trying to find ways, identify drugs established, used for other things that are approved for other things that might be effective in lupus. So those are ongoing. The Accelerating Medicines Partnership, AMP, has been alluded to a couple times. These are the partners that came together to try to tackle two autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And it's actually it's a wonderful thing for this community that lupus has been involved in this project. You can see the corporate sponsors, 2 NIH institutes, and most of the advocacy organizations that work in the autoimmune and lupus space have been supportive. Mary Collins has been the representative for the LRI and ALR, and I would say she's had actually a quite important role in helping steering this along with the other partners, so it is a true partnership. What are we actually doing? The idea that controlled sort of rheumatology research for most of when I was growing up was that you studied animal models, found something abnormal in the animal, and went to see if in the patient that if you could attack that problem, that mechanism, and see if the patient got better. That actually didn't work so well. The focus now is understanding what's going on in the human and then figuring out what's wrong in human with disease like lupus. And if you need to go back and reconstruct an animal that does the similar thing so you can see how you can manipulate it. Well, in the AMP, what we're doing is actually getting tissue from humans with RA and lupus. From the kidney, and patients are undergoing biopsies for medical indicated reasons in lupus, and synovial biopsies in rheumatoid arthritis. And then taking the sort of cutting-edge technologies to understand what is happening at the cellular and molecular level in the tissues of the patients with disease. It's a tall order. It's tough to get those tissues. We do need patients to volunteer. We've taken a bunch of the different omics, sort of looking at proteins, cells, genetics, different molecules that control cells, and then integrate all that to try to understand the disease as it happens in patients with them. So I mentioned the genetics, the microbiome as an infector, and that this will lead then to a better understanding of the mechanisms between patients with different types of RA or different types of lupus, how they're different, and how to treat them better. So I hope I've given you a picture that there actually is progress, that we are making progress. We are moving down the road. The roadmap lays out the sort of path, the signposts, that we are actually making progress. As was alluded to by Congressman Keating, lupus is no longer a death sentence. It can be a horrible problem. It can still kill people, but it is not a death sentence. We have made progress, and I think I'm trying to say to you that the work ongoing now is taking new findings to understand the disease in people and get those into clinic in new treatments. So we can't do this by ourselves. We need the help of the community to get the word out that this research is happening and it needs support across the country and in Congress. So that's why we're here today. And we have lots of publications and with things on the web like clinicaltrials.gov where you can go to look at all the studies that are being done in lupus. You can narrow that down to find ones that are located near you. There's other literature we have on lupus for those who would like to know more. But finally, we would like to keep in touch with you. We've developed a lot of social media presence. We hope to keep this dialogue going and keep us moving down the road to a cure for lupus. Thank you.